All right, welcome to your final lecture of Religions of Japan this summer. Week 9 we're at, and based on the popular vote, as it were, folk religion is the topic we've gone to, which actually ties in very nicely with religion in popular culture. And I'll talk about a couple current events, again, mostly coronavirus, at the end of the lecture before we wrap up. Okay, so let's first start by talking about what actually is folk religion. Some of you may be familiar with this term or with folklore, but I'm going to give you a little sort of historical grounding. First of all, the field of folklore emerged in the 19th century, and what it sort of originated in is this term folk, or the German folk as well, which generally meant the common people, really referring to peasants and often those who were still illiterate during the 19th century. Right? So there's a focus on the stories that they transmitted through oral means, right? Particularly stories, this is where folk tales and fairy tales, as they're sometimes called, become really popular, as well as other traditions and cultures. So a really good example of this is, of course, the Brothers Grimm, who are collecting the folk tales of the largely Germanic folk, right? Seeking out common people and their stories and seeing sort of what they mean. So today, folk is a little bit more, the definition of folk has expanded greatly to be pretty much any social group with a shared identity and distinctive traditions. So this is studied both in the humanities, especially literature and religion, as you can imagine, and in social sciences. But this could be certainly religious groups, they could be sports fans, they could be college clubs. Really, they can, it's really a very wide term. And so when we talk about folk religion, it sometimes is thought to be popular religion, but again, it really depends on sort of how you're envisioning both of these terms, right? What might be a, sort of popular religion statistically, also sometimes refers to religions that are just not, sort of tied in to particular institutions, right? So forms and expressions of religion that are distinct from organized religion can often be called folk religion. So not always, but they do often emerge along ethnic, regional, or class lines, right? Many of the regional practices that we see in Japan and in other places are often, again, grouped into folk religion. And again, they're very often syncretic, right? In the case of Japan, we tend to see a lot of elements of both Buddhism and Shinto, as well as other religious traditions and regional variations. Okay, so again, moving more specifically to Japan, one idea that has come up in the past couple of decades is this idea of common religion being a better term than folk religion, right? Which is kind of, tied to the history of folklore studies. So Tanabe and Reeder, most of you have used Ian Reeder's Shinto Simple Guides book before. They postulate this idea of common religion, which is basically that there are shared beliefs, customs, and practices across class lines and regions in Japan. And what this really centers on is the idea that you get practical benefits from a syncretic spirit world. Again, many Japanese today, even though they might claim to be Mushukyo, would pray equally to Kami and Buddhas, and there's not really seemingly a huge difference between them. And a lot of times people are praying for tangible things, right? Passing an exam, good job, a good marriage partner, having a baby, their health of family members, etc. So the implication here that this is really the default religion of Japan, right? Especially if we go back to those surveys that talk about the various religious activities that people engage in, we did see some relatively high numbers, right, in the 2/3 or so. So if we kind of define religion or think about this common religion, there is certainly something to what Tanabe and Reeder are saying. So if we think about, actual sort of forms of folk religion in Japan that we can define, there are a few I'll mention here, and I'll be happy to talk about in more detail in class. One is Shugendo, which some of you have come across already. It's a syncretic mountain religion, largely focused in northern Japan, but you'll still see it elsewhere, and involving a lot of ascetic practices, right? People train not only to climb these mountains, but to, sort of attain spiritual awakening while doing so. And these are also some of the mountains that we talked about where the various realms of Buddhist existence are mapped on to these particular mountains, and so you're kind of thought to be going from heaven to paradise as you walk through. So again, this is in some ways more closely related to Buddhism, but it sort of depends. There's also a more localized belief in animal spirits and ghosts and supernatural creatures. Many people would say that the Japanese are not particularly religious, but very superstitious. And there's some grain of truth in it, but again, there's a sort of very vibrant spirit world to work with. So that again, sort of can be regional or can be more sort of universal. There are also shamanic practices in which people are thought to be able to communicate directly with deities, whether kami or Buddhas, and in some cases, the same person might communicate with both kinds of deities, or with, sort of more local deities, with ancestors, with dead spirits. That's, it really depends. It's, again, very sort of region specific. And we might consider whether new religious movements are folk religions, or whether some of them may have been early on. If we think back to some of the early ones, like Tenrikyo and Omotokyo, maybe they sort of started out as folk religions, but now have a broader institutional base. So that's something to consider, and something that many scholars debate. So again, the problem with defining folk religion today certainly remains. But again, we see in all of these that they are highly syncretic, not directly affiliated with Buddhism or Shinto in any way, although deriving ideas from both of them and from other traditions. And many of these forms of folk religion were greatly impacted by both modernization and, as you can imagine, repression under Imperial Japan. Some of them considered to not be religions anymore, or not okay to practice. So because of that, some of these are dying out. That's definitely true of many of the shamanic traditions of Japan, as well as certainly some new religions. And some are undergoing revival. For instance, Shugendo, the mountain religion. This was totally shut down during most of the Imperial Japan period, but has really sort of revived. And, there are quite a lot of sort of Shugendo retreats that you can go on and such. All right, so moving into, sort of considering the pop culture side of things, I think you'll already see some correlations between folk religion and the religious elements that we start to see in films and other things. So I'd like to start with Princess Mononoke, not only because I absolutely love this film, but because I think, again, it shows some of these folk elements that we're talking about. So a little background on the movie. It's by Studio Ghibli. The director is Miyazaki, who's directed many, many of the Ghibli films, not all of them. It was the highest grossing film in Japan in 1997, and it actually maintained the box office record until a few years later when Spirited Away came out, and Spirited Away held that for a very long time. So Miyazaki, in general, is noted for his pacifism. He was born during World War II, and environmentalism, and these are themes you see in a lot of his films. He doesn't specifically say that he draws inspiration from Shinto or other traditions, but again, you'll judge that for yourself. So the film is set in sort of an imagined 14th century Japan. It's so again, kind of during the Warring States period. But in addition to tension between humans, you see tensions between gods and nature, and technology and modernity, sort of those kind of categories in opposition and struggling against each other. There's also a lot of moral ambivalence. There's no sort of clear good and bad. Like the kami in general, people can be sort of act compassionately or act, out of vengeance. But, here again, there's no sort of clear evil. And one thing I'd like to mention, especially when I'm teaching my course on women and religion in Japan, is that women are central characters, and they really challenge gender norms in a way that you didn't see in earlier Ghibli films. So some of the religious elements, there are first of all some kami, they're tatarigami, which literally means cursing god or cursed god. It could be interpreted both ways. Unfortunately, it's often translated as demon, which is actually a different category known as oni, but I see why they do that in translations, because without the cultural context of what cursing god might be, it's a little difficult to understand. So we definitely have kami. We also have Mononoke, that's indeed the title of the film, which are sort of vengeful spirits. They can be either living or dead. They're often, sort of considered to be strange, sort of apart from clear categorization, and often harmful. So here you see that Princess Mononoke herself is human, but she's called Mononoke because she identifies very closely with the wolves, and she is sort of full of anger and revenge. And so there is a tension that you'll see even just in the trailer in terms of, is she human? Can she return to the human world? What else is she? There are also the kodama, these adorable tree spirits. And this is, again, something that we, they're not specifically kami, although we do find kami, sort of tied or located in trees. But this kind of, again, draws from more sort of a folklore idea of the natural world. There are also a number of animal gods of the mountain. The wolves you see above. There's also the boars. That's the first kind of cursing god that starts the story. There are apes, and then there's this deer god who is also kind of the god of life and death, in a way that, again, is very, very different from what we see in Shinto, but draws on a lot of, sort of folk religious ideas connected to animals in the natural world. Okay, so this brings us into the broader topic of religion and popular culture and imagination. And this is where Shinto does particularly well. If you look even just at the list of the anime I gave you for Project 3, you'll note that a lot more of them kind of have to do with Shinto, or at least have elements derived from Shinto. So, for instance, this is a great source material for spirits, demons, many of the sort of fantastic concepts that we see in anime, film, and other ideas, especially if there are other worlds. Shinto in particular also serves as a marker of Japan or Japaneseness, right? If you see a torii like you see here in, unfortunately, I should have redone the script, but this torii that you see on the side here is from Your Name, a very famous anime movie that came out in 2016. It's also a marker of tradition versus modernity, right? If we see a shrine or its buildings, then we see, some semblance of tradition happening, even sometimes if it's in the midst of Tokyo or another world. And Shinto shrines in the Shinto establishment itself have diverse reactions to this. Some sort of embrace it as, something that's bringing people back to Shinto, especially if a particular shrine appears in an anime and people come visit it. They see that as all to the good. Others sort of deplore this as, sort of inaccurate representations of Shinto. Buddhist elements are a little less frequent, but they're definitely there. Some of the most notable ways are, again, the ideas of karma, rebirth, alternate worlds, alternate planes of existence, certainly appear in a lot of different anime, even some that might be otherwise more closely classed with Shinto. And then in a lot of film and anime I've seen, there's a Buddhist monk or priest, sometimes a bodhisattva, as a side character, a mentor, a voice of wisdom, maybe only appearing in one episode, but still, sort of, providing that sort of, compassion from a higher being. And I think this is really significant because Japanese pop culture is now pretty popular worldwide, right? How many of you are here because, from anime or games, you've seen some of these elements and been intrigued, right? And I think this will have a really interesting impact on Japanese religions going forward, especially some of these traditional religions. So because now there's a worldwide interest in Japanese traditions, my classes are growing in enrollment, certainly, but beyond that, there are a lot of people, sort of looking up and wanting to learn about Shinto and Buddhism and how religion works in Japan. So this really, interacts with a lot of different areas. One certainly is tourism, not so big right now, but up until recently, there's been a huge growth in tourism in Japan. In academia, this Asian studies is still growing in general, and that's equally true of Japan. And there's a much larger foreign presence in Japan with, people who are living there who also really want to get to know Japanese culture and might be participating in some of the religious activities, especially matsuri. Okay, so one sort of example or something I wanted to bring up is, a sort of new model for overseas shrines rather than the shrines we saw during the imperial period that were forced on various countries and areas that were colonized by Japan. We also have some shrines in the US and other places now that are, sort of bringing Shinto around in a new way. So, as an example of this, I wanted to introduce you to Shusse Inari of America, which is located in Los Angeles. It's a branch shrine of Shusse Inari in Matsue, in Shimane, which is really, really rural Japan. It's not far from Izumo. And so the priest, a shrine priest, is her name is Izumi Hasegawa, and she's from a shrine family, from the family in charge of Shusse Inari in Matsue. She's also a film journalist, so she sort of used and adapted technology in really interesting ways. So, for instance, in the new Shusse Inari LA, it doesn't have a physical location yet. It's sort of a mobile shrine, although they are working towards building a community center. There are a lot of services in Matsuri online. They have their own YouTube channel, which includes videos called Inari Dojo, or training center. Dojo is the same word used for the sort of training centers for martial arts, like karate. And so on this Inari Dojo, as she calls it, with this super cute image, there are translations, explanations of Shinto rituals. There, again, Matsuri can be viewed. And in the description of the shrine, Hasegawa also she really emphasizes this idea of Shinto as a nature religion, directly referencing global warming and suggesting that one of the things Shinto can bring to the world, can bring outside of Japan, is an appreciation for nature and living, sort of an environmentally sound lifestyle. So we might think about, this as one way that, certainly shrines are working to reverse their images, but it's equally true of, Buddhist temples, that, there are more and more Zen and other temples in the US and elsewhere. So we are seeing some growth in Japanese religions outside of Japan as well. Finally, I wanted to talk about Japanese religious traditions and coronavirus. The most famous that was not only brought up by our group work this week from the group that worked on Happy Science, but also has appeared in news articles, is the new religious movement Happy Science's spiritual vaccines that are being provided to protect people against coronavirus. And, this really plays into the idea of, Japan being quirky and new religions being quirky. But actually, it's interesting, if you really read into this, many new religious groups in Japan halted in-person services, closed their centers, really shut things down much earlier than most traditional religions in Japan. And one of the key reasons for this is a concern over the possible additional stigma, right? They already have a bad reputation, as it were, because of Om Shinrikyo, and many of these particular new religions were very concerned about, there being an outbreak and them being blamed for it and increasing this stigma. And that's, pretty much exactly what happened in South Korea with this one particular church that kept holding services. And, the church alone, basically, its members kind of accounted for thousands of cases within Korea. So anyway, on the more positive note, there have been very positive reactions from Japanese people to temple and shrines providing anti-coronavirus rituals. And Tojaiji, the temple we talked about quite a long time ago, right? The one with the big Buddha, has daily expulsion rituals since March. So people are no longer allowed to come worship in the temple, but they are, sort of doing these rituals and posting about them, as you might you see at the first slide of this presentation. On the Shinto side of things, Matatabisha Shrine in Tokyo, which is connected to Yasaka in Gion, again, that's the shrine that's in charge of Gion Festival, is performing the Gion Goryo-e, right? The festival sort of trying to disperse vengeful spirits as well as, gods of disease. But of course, there's no actual Gion Festival this year, as we talked about earlier. Another sort of, fun and playful aspect of this, and again tying in perhaps a bit more to folk religions, is the resurrection not only of anti-epidemic rituals but also amulets and figures like the two you see here. The coronavirus prevention amulet from Chofukuji. It shows this guy Ryogen, who was a Tendai monk long ago but was successful in repelling a smallpox epidemic, as well as this really cute figure, Amabie, who's sort of mermaid-esque. Other pictures are a little less cute. Whether or not she's a kami is perhaps a good question, but she not only predicts harvests, but also cures disease, is making a recent comeback. And this particular image was made by my very talented artist friend, so I wanted to share it with you. All right, so discussion questions. I've kept them pretty short and sweet this week. First of all, what comes to mind when you think of folk religion? How does folk religion in Japan compare to other folk traditions you know about? What religious elements have you encountered in Japanese pop culture and video arts? This is one place where we can discuss a little bit about our projects and things we've seen. And finally, how might the use of new technologies and, sort of staying current, as we see with, the coronavirus and these religions, how might that renew interest in Japanese religious traditions or sort of change what they do and what they are? And finally, I'll leave some space for you to just ask me any questions about Japan, about Japanese religion, about the time I've spent there. Anything you want to ask, just sort of keep in mind if there have been questions you've been wondering about and you haven't had a chance to ask, now would be the time. All right, thanks for your attention, and I will see you later this week.